Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to continue with Detective Slinger's testimony. Detective Slinger, if you take the stand again. Since it's the afternoon session, I'll ask Madam Clerk to re-swear you in.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your full name.
Brian Slinger, S-L-I-N-G-E-R.
Thank you.
And just to, for the record, Attorney Saunders, you had completed your direct at this time, is that right?
Yes, sir.
All right, then cross-examination.
Yes, Judge, thank you. Good afternoon, Sergeant Slinger.
Afternoon.
Sergeant Slinger, you're with the Brown County Sheriff's Office, that's correct, right?
Correct.
And how long did you say you'd been there?
I'll be 18 years this May,
And how long have you been a detective there?
since August of 2015.
Okay, and what were your duties prior to being a detective?
I was a narcotics investigator.
And remind us again what those duties entailed?
That's particularly with the Brown County Drug Task Force doing certain drug investigations.
So potentially controlled buys
Correct.
or surveilling residences?
Correct.
Vehicle stops and everything related to investigating narcotics crimes, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And have you had any other roles within the Brown County Sheriff's Office?
I was a patrol officer on night shift and afternoon shift up until the time I got in the drug task force. I was also a member of the Brown County SWAT team, also a team leader of the Brown County dive team.
Okay. And so in those various roles, excuse me one second. For example, as a patrolman, you were required to drive the streets of Brown County?
Correct.
You're required to know the area well?
Correct.
So that if you get a call, you can get to the scene in the most direct way possible?
Back when I first started, we had to utilize road maps, which made it a little more difficult, but nowadays GPS. But yes, you need to have a general idea of where you're going.
Now you can use things like GPS and Google Maps or MapQuest or any of those things?
Correct.
Okay. And what are the primary duties of a detective?
Like I explained earlier, we are a unit that's typically assigned to follow up on cases that come to us. Could be anything from a retail theft, sexual assault, a battery, anything that the patrol division would have started and done an initial report on, and then would have gotten forwarded to us for further investigation.
Okay. And as you said earlier, you're one of the lead detectives on this case?
Correct.
And that's why you've been sitting at council table?
Correct.
You've communicated with the district attorney's office about your findings and opinions in this case?
Yes.
Okay. And you've essentially done that from the beginning of becoming a lead detective on the case?
Correct.
As you've indicated, once you got assigned as lead, you reviewed essentially everything that had been done prior to your appointment as lead detective?
Correct.
You got up to speed on the case?
Correct.
And then going forward, one of your duties, I guess, would be requesting other law enforcement members to perform various tasks.
Yes.
Okay, and you did various tasks yourself.
Correct.
And if you sent someone to do a task and they did that task, you would then follow up with them to see how that went.
Correct, and reviewing their reports that they would have done from that.
Okay, so I believe you said on direct that as a result of that work, you essentially know every facet of this case.
Correct.
Everything that's been done.
Correct.
Everything that's not been done.
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, there may be a few things that I can't remember exact details on. As you've alluded to earlier, there is a lot of information in this case, so to expect me to memorize everything I think would be a bit extreme, but I have a very good understanding of the case, yes.
Sure. You're the one of the go-to guys regarding this case for the... Go ahead.
Correct.
Okay. So, you talked about this on direct examination, but let's just go back to the beginning of your involvement in this case. When were you first notified that you would be working this case?
Would I be the lead on it?
Let's start with when you were just notified you were going to be working on it.
On Sunday the 22nd, May 22nd.
Of 2016?
Correct.
And how were you notified?
I was actually at the sheriff's office for a different responsibility that day, finishing my duty, and I was notified by Lieutenant Valley that he requested I stay to assist with this scene.
And at that point, the scene was the Hoffman Road location?
Correct.
So and I believe you said you went to that location at that point?
I did.
You met with officers there?
Yes.
As you've done throughout this case, you spoke with them and gathered as much information as you could?
Correct.
And is it at that point, on that first arrival on the scene, that you testified you helped with a grid search?
Correct.
And you were in the courtroom, so we have heard testimony about what a grid search is. You alluded to that in your testimony. I believe you stated that that grid search, did it start at the location of the body?
Correct.
And I believe you said it went west of the body?
Slightly to the west, yes. Towards where the field runs there, as we saw in the pictures earlier, it goes up to where there's a duplex or a residence a little bit to the west there. We extended it down probably, I don't know, 50 yards past where the body was located towards that house to the west.
Okay, so you said it was about 50 yards
It's just a
west?
rough estimate, yes.
And what about south? How far south did you guys
We
go?
went south to about, when you saw those pictures earlier, where that mound was. There was a mound of dirt or whatever in between where the body was and in between where those tire marks were earlier. We focused on that area in between the tree line and that mound of dirt where the tire tracks were of the car.
What about your search east? What did you guys do?
We went right up until the edge of the gravel driveway.
Okay, so essentially you stopped once you hit Hoffman Road?
Well, that would have been east, so we wouldn't have hit Hoffman Road.
Right, okay.
It was the gravel driveway that entered into that field that we have seen on the pictures is where we stopped.
Okay. And what about north?
There was some brief searches throughout the woods there. I was not part of that.
Okay,
You mean, which would have been towards Hoffman Road? Yes, I was not part of that search.
okay. Remind us again, after you did that grid search, what was your next involvement in the case?
My next involvement was to go out and take witness statements from some of the people that were mentioned in Doug Dietrich's statement to law enforcement in reference to who he was out with the night prior.
Okay. And what led you to, I guess, Doug Dietrich and the people he was with before?
It was the missing person report that was filed and information that was gathered through the interview with him.
Okay. And so you took I believe you conducted some interviews?
I did.
You took some statements?
I did.
Other officers did interviews?
Correct.
And they took statements?
Yes.
You reviewed their work?
Yes.
Or were at least made aware of
I was
their
made
work?
aware and read through them to say that I reviewed them for proper spelling and punctuation and stuff. I did not, but I did review the reports, yes.
Right, because that's not your job as a detective.
Correct.
Okay. When was the first time you were at the 2329 Berkeley Road address?
Inside?
Just at the residence?
At the residence,
Yeah.
the first time I was in that general area was Monday evening when we were called back there by Matthew Peterson.
Okay, and that was when he was reporting that he found that cord in his yard and wanted to make law enforcement aware?
Correct.
And did you speak with Mr. Peterson?
I did not.
Other officers did?
Correct. Sergeant Yankee, Sergeant Tilley, there's a few others already on scene. I was in the middle of something else at the sheriff's office at the time and didn't respond immediately.
Okay. When did you respond?
Shortly thereafter, maybe 5-10 minutes after they got there, they were still in the process of setting up their yellow markers that you'd seen earlier.
Over the course of, I guess, this case from the beginning, you've gone to the Berkeley Road address several times.
Correct.
And you did eventually go in the residence.
Recently, yes.
Okay. And again, as lead detective, you're aware that there's been various searches done at the residence?
Yes.
And you're aware that there's been canvassing of the neighborhood?
Yes.
Okay.
Come right ahead. Sidebar and clarify some testimony. Continue with your class and take the steps.
Detective?
He's trying.
Speaking of the microphone, Attorney Slinger. All right.
Now that is an insult.
All right. Attorney Stebbins, you may continue with your cross.
I believe I left off by asking you that you're aware the neighborhood was canvassed.
Correct.
And over those, I guess, initial first few days and first few weeks, there was a lot of information coming in.
Yes.
Both from people, surveillance videos, physical evidence. It was kind of coming in from all angles.
Yes.
And you and your coworkers and other agencies were working hard and diligently to be able to get in, to be able to process all of that evidence.
Absolutely.
And you were doing that in the hopes of figuring out what happened to Nicole.
Correct.
Okay. And then based on receiving that evidence, you're aware that eventually several search warrants were drafted for the Dietrich residence?
2, yes.
Okay, two search warrants. Could you briefly describe the process of obtaining a search warrant?
Sure. So first you need to obviously draw a nexus or a reason that you're interested in a certain residence, so to speak, so that you have a lawful reason to be there. You go through the facts of the case, through information that you received throughout, through witness statements, through information that we received. You put that onto a search warrant form, you apply that to the courts, judge reviews it, determines if there's enough probable cause within that to give us the ability to search the residence.
So then, presumably on two separate occasions, a judge gave you the okay to search the residence,
Correct.
based on the evidence you collected and presented to the judge.
Correct.
Okay. You testified about this already. I'm not going to go over it extensively, but initially, essentially, all signs pointed to Douglas Dietrich as being the primary suspect.
At the beginning, yes.
Okay. And I believe you testified in your role as being lead detective is you gather, not only do you gather the information, make referrals, well, I guess you gather information and then you make referrals to the district attorney's office. Is that correct?
Once we make an arrest, then we would refer those documents to the district attorney's office, correct?
Okay. In this case, did you speak to the district attorney's office prior to Mr. Dietrich's arrest?
We were in constant communication with them. In all times when we write search warrants, we do obtain, we have them reviewed by the district attorney's office on occasion, yes.
So while you...
Interject prior to the next line of questioning, I'd like to be heard on this as well.
All right, I saw our sidebar was just to make sure we don't go into an area that we need not get into, so Attorney Stebbins, you may continue with your cross-examination.
Thank you, Judge. And eventually you decided that you would be arresting Douglas Dietrich.
Correct.
And I believe you said that now Detective Holschbach, then Detective Steffens, had a rapport built with Douglas Dietrich.
Correct.
So she placed a call to him.
Correct.
You learned that he was at his parents' house.
Correct.
And you then went to his parents' house once you knew he was there.
Correct.
You didn't ask him to voluntarily come to the sheriff's office.
We were already out at the scene in front of Mr. Dietrich's house on Berkeley, relatively close distance. We had known at that point that we were going to be taking him into custody, so we just drove over to his residence.
Okay. And can you tell us again, or maybe you didn't tell us, what do you look for? What do you think about prior to making an arrest? What standards do you look at?
Well, we think obviously the totality of everything that we have at that time. We don't obviously have answers to all of our DNA evidence that we have. We can look at a picture, so to speak, and what a scene would appear to be to us prior to getting any in-depth analysis back from that. So it would be just the initial appearance that you would look at. Like I spoke of earlier, what we thought was blood in the garage, the shoes that we saw in the garage, the vehicle condition, the scene in close proximity to the residence. Those types of things went into the decision.
In addition to the information you received from the interviews and speaking with people that were last with Nicole?
Correct.
Okay. Now, getting, I guess, back into the process of making referrals to the district attorney's office, are some incidences or, I guess, crimes or disturbances, sometimes are those referrals made without there ever being an arrest?
Yes.
Meaning you can refer a case over to the district attorney's office even absent an arrest.
Correct.
But in this case, you just decided to arrest Douglas Dietrich.
Yeah, I mean, due to the nature of the crime, due to the timing, a lot of times when we do what you just referred to as a out-of-custody referral, it may be for a more minor offense. It may be for something that happened a while past. That is something that wasn't happening imminently, that was maybe a month or two past, that we feel like there's potentially no reason to take them into custody at that time, and that it's something that can the district attorney's office would have time to review and then make a decision on at that point if they would be charging it or not.
But in this case, based on the information you had received, I think what you said, given the nature of the crime, you decided it was appropriate to apprehend Douglas Dietrich immediately.
Correct.
And again, that arrest was made outside his parents' home on Euro Lane?
Yes.
He was placed into handcuffs,
Yes,
locked behind his back.
I believe so.
Okay. And then you escorted him into a police vehicle
It was a unmarked minivan that we had.
that was being operated by law enforcement.
Correct.
Okay. And from there, you went directly to the jail.
Yes.
You referred Mr. Dietrich over to jail staff,
Yes.
and you informed him as well as jailhouse staff that he was being charged with or arrested, not charged, arrested for the first-degree murder of Nicole Vanderheiden.
Yes, and I would have filled out what's common jail booking / information sheet, which would have had all that information on it.
Okay. Now, on cross, you testified that when Dietrich was in your car, I think you said it seemed like someone had shot his dog. Is that correct?
Not in the car, when I had initially told him that he was going to be arrested and had him turn around to put the handcuffs on him.
In your years of experience, you've obviously arrested a lot of people.
A lot's a speculative word, but yeah, I would say
How many people have you arrested approximately?
probably in the hundreds.
Okay. Everybody reacts differently, correct?
Correct.
Okay. You, prior to your investigation of this case, did you know Doug Dietrich?
I did not.
You ever see him laugh?
No.
You ever see him cry?
No.
You ever seen him sad?
No,
Prior-
I had never seen him, period.
Okay. So let's, sorry to jump around with you, but let's go back to the beginning. You were originally at the Hoffman scene doing a grid search,
Correct.
and you're also aware of the searches that were done. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. You physically actually participated in some of the searches.
I did not.
The grid search?
The grid search, yes. I thought you were referring to the residence.
Nope, we're just talking about Hoffman here. So
Just Hoffman, yes, correct.
And you're aware of the other searches that law enforcement members did.
Correct.
Judge, may I approach to grab some exhibits?
Right in.
Sergeant Slinger, I'm going to hand you what's been previously marked Exhibit 89 through Exhibit 97. Can you just take a moment to go through these, please?
Sure.
Okay.
Do you have a chance to review those?
I did.
Can you tell what they are?
They are printouts of Google Maps, some of them from the area of Hoffman Road and Bellevue Street, where the area that Nicole's body was located, and some of them of a more close-up view of the East River Trail area and the village of Alloway, which is just to the west of the location where the body was located. And then there's also a couple overview shots that are more broad of more of the east side, in particular, that general area where the body was located, as well as Mr. Dietrich's and Nicole's residence.
Okay. And like you said before, you're familiar with Google Maps and things of that nature?
Yes.
And you're familiar with the scenes that are at issue in this case?
Yes.
And you're familiar with Brown County from your role as a patrolman and just general knowledge of the area?
Yes.
Okay. Let's start with exhibit number 89. Can you tell us specifically what that is?
Exhibit 89 is a copy of a Google map that appeared to be, assuming, downloaded from google.com. It is a depiction of Hoffman Road, which runs east and west. It has Bellevue Street, County Highway XX, running to the north off of that. And then slightly to the west would be where the East River is depicted by a darker color with the words East River on it. And then that goes further west on Hoffman Road into the village of Alloway, where there's East River Drive, the Village Grill, the village of Alloway Park is also notated on the picture. And then to the north on Bellevue Street, there's also a Crystal Lake Circle, which has a Crystal Lake diagram on the far upper right corner.
Judge, I'd ask permission for exhibit number 89 to be admitted into evidence and published to the jury.
Subject to redirect any objection to 89 being received.
No objection.
Are we gonna do this old school?
I have it on my computer, so if everything works, I think we'll be able to do it new school.
I think everyone would prefer that when we try to get it on the big screen.
Sergeant Slinger, does this appear to be exhibit 89 with the exception that this is now being displayed from a computer desktop?
And it's also in color. This picture is black and white that you gave to me.
But as far as the layouts and the various locations that you depicted when describing the actual exhibit, does this image on the screen appear consistent?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if that pointer is still up there, but if it is, could you please point on the screen the approximate area where Nicole's body was discovered?
I don't see it up here, but
Oh,
I should be able to reach it otherwise, if you want to.
May I approach the witness?
Go right ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Yep.
Roughly in this area, right in here.
Okay, and then could you describe the areas of the grid search using that map?
Sure, kind of. I mean, right here is a grassy area, which you saw earlier in the pictures with some trees, things of that nature. There's a noticeable line right here, which is where the field would be. So we searched from about here to where that entrance road would be here, across, and then out until where there's probably a mound of dirt, a hill right here, because the tracks from the vehicle that we had in there were in between this area, so we focused on that area in particular. It's a large field. I couldn't imagine how long it would have took us to do that entire field.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, can everyone hear you? Detective Slinger? All right, go ahead.
Did you do any search that went northwest towards the East River?
I did not. I was not a part of a search like that, no.
Was there that search done? Was that
Not to
search
my
done?
knowledge.
Okay. What about a search of the East River itself?
No,
No one went in the water?
no,
No one searched the banks of the river?
no.
Okay. I'll have you take a look at exhibit number 90. Could you please describe what this is?
This is just a zoomed in version of that picture focusing on Hoffman Road as well as the East River near that intersection, and then a little bit south of that towards Alloway Kiwanis Park.
Judge, I'd move exhibit number 90 into evidence and ask permission to publish on the screen.
Any objection? No. All right, 90 is received and can be published.
Sergeant Slinger, does this appear to be exhibit 90, again with the exception that this is being shown on a computer screen?
Yes.
If you look at the East River, there's a trail, or what runs alongside the East River?
It would appear the East River Trail.
Are you familiar with the East River Trail?
Somewhat.
You're aware that it's a, I guess, recreational trail
Correct.
for biking, walking, things of that nature?
Correct.
Okay. And the East River Trail follows the East River?
I would assume so.
Okay. Did any officers search the East River Trail?
Not to my knowledge.
All right, I'll have you look at exhibit number 91, please. And please inform us of what that is.
Same general view. It just focuses a little. It's a little broader, and it incorporates more to the south.
Judge, I'd ask to admit it, number 91 into evidence and to publish it on the screen.
Any objection? No objection. 91 is received and can be published.
Sergeant Slinger, is that exhibit number 91?
Yes.
And again, you testified that this is somewhat broader than, or I guess zoomed out from the previous image. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can you still see on that map where the East River Trail is?
Yes.
Could you identify it?
It's identified with the green line that's running to the west of the East River.
And again, it does follow the East River Trail?
Yes.
Okay, I'll have you take a look at exhibit number 92, please. And I guess before we get to 92, looking back at 91, you can see Hoffman Road and the double X sign, and again, that's the approximate area where the body was found.
Yes.
Okay. You can go ahead and go back to exhibit number 92 and please describe what that is.
That is a overhead picture of the village of Alloway. I'm gonna probably slaughter this name, but YZ Park, which is off of East River Drive in LeBron, that runs into Bower Creek.
Judge, I'd move exhibit number 92 and ask to publish it to the jury.
Any objection? No objection. 92 is received and may be published.
Sergeant Slinger, is this exhibit number 92?
Yes.
And does it appear to be a continuation of the previous maps that follow the East River?
Yes.
And again, in this image, can you see the East River Trail?
Yes,
And it's again identifiable by that green line running along the East River.
correct.
And again, was any portion of this East River Trail searched?
No, not to my knowledge.
Was any portion of the East River searched?
No, not to my knowledge.
And was any portion of the banks of the river searched?
Not to my knowledge.
Judge, Sergeant Slinger, I'd ask that you go on to exhibit number 93. And please describe it to the jury.
This again is a broader, I would say larger view of that area, starting at the top this time with the Village of Alloway Park, and then just a further south view from there.
Judge, I'd move this exhibit and ask for publication.
Any objection?
No objection.
93 is received and can be published.
Sergeant Slinger, is this exhibit 93?
Yes,
Can you still see the East River on this map?
I can.
And am I correct if I were to say that, and I will butcher the name as well, towards the south end of the Alloway Wisey Park, the East River appears to narrow?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And the East River Trail, though, continues to follow it?
Yes,
Okay. Were any portions of this part of the East River Trail searched?
they were not.
And what about the river,
No,
nor its banks?
no.
You can move on to exhibit number 94, please, and describe what it is.
This is a more broad view, I guess you could say, of the area, starting with Ledgeview Road, working to the north, which cuts off roughly around Hoffman Road, where the body would have been located, and then goes west into the city of De Pere, east out to the Green Bay Country Sports Club on Lime Kiln Road.
And Judge, this won't go on too much longer, but I would ask for this exhibit to be moved into evidence and published to the jury.
It's fine. 94, any objection? 94 is received and can be published.
I think this was 95.
Or 95? 95 received, and let's publish it.
Is that 95?
No, that's 94.
Okay. Can we look?
It is 94. For the record, we're looking at 94 on the screen at
Right.
this time.
I would have you look at exhibit 94, please.
Okay?
And is exhibit 94 currently on the board, on the screen?
Yes.
And could you please describe what this area is? Let me ask you this. Is this still a continuation of the path of the East River from the previous image we had on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. And you can still see the East River Trail?
Yes.
Were any of these portions of the East River searched?
They were not.
Were the banks of the river searched?
No.
Was the East River Trail searched?
No.
Okay, now I'd ask that you go on to exhibit number 95, and for the record, I think I said 94 the first time, but I would ask that it be accepted into evidence.
94 has been accepted.
Okay, so Sergeant Slinger, will you please turn your attention to exhibit 95?
Yes.
And what is this exhibit?
That's the one I had just explained. It's a broader view, which goes west into the city of De Pere, and then east out to the Green Bay Country Club, which is out by County Highway V and Bower Creek Road, and then goes south down to Ledgeview Road area.
Judge, I'd move exhibit number 95 and ask permission to publish.
Any objection? 95 is received and may be published.
Sergeant Slinger, is this exhibit number 95?
Yes.
And like you said, it's zoomed out essentially from the previous images.
Correct.
It might not be completely identifiable, but could you please point out again where the body was found approximately?
The body has been found approximately up in this area here, which is the center of the screen, right up in the middle.
Oh, and then again, if we had, the images we've looked at essentially have been close-ups of the path of the East River Trail,
Correct.
and the overall path of it is identifiable on that image?
Of the East River itself, yes.
Okay, correct, because you can't see the East River Trail on this map, right?
Correct.
But we know from the previous images that it follows the East River.
Yes.
Okay. On this image, are you able to identify approximately where Mr. Dietrich's residence would be?
It's a little out of the view. I would say it's I can show you if you'd like.
Let me just ask you this. Could I have you take a look at exhibit number 96?
Yes.
What is that exhibit?
This is a similar view that this one is, except again, it's a little bit broader, a little bit more zoomed out, so to speak, that gives us more streets.
And does exhibit number 96 have actual directions on it or no? or a marked route?
It does have a marked route on it, yes.
Judge, I'd ask for exhibit number 96 to be admitted and prefer permission to publish.
Any objection?
Objection.
96 is received, and let's publish it.
Sergeant Slinger, is this exhibit number 96?
Yes.
Could you again identify, well, let me ask you this. You see on this map that 1374 Hoffman Road is in bold text?
Yes.
Is that approximately where the body was found?
Correct.
And 2329 Berkeley Road is also highlighted, do you agree?
Yes.
And that's Douglas Dietrich's residence?
Yes.
And can you see the East River Trail? Let me ask you this. Can I have you point to the East River Trail at its closest proximity to 1374 Hoffman Road?
Yes. So this is where you've been talking about earlier, where the East River Trail would have started on the west side of the river. It would have followed down here, around, and then presumably through this box here, down to here. And I'm not familiar with how far down itself goes, so I can't speak to that as far as the trail itself, but this is the East River.
And again, no portions of that river were searched?
Correct.
No portions of the banks of that river were searched?
No.
And similarly, the East River Trail was not searched?
Correct.
I guess there's one other thing that I didn't identify on here, and again, you agree that this is a Google Maps image?
Yes.
And towards the top, do you see that it's typed in 1374 Hoffman Road? Do you see that?
I do.
Could you read the rest of that, please?
Green Bay, Wisconsin, 54311, 2329 Berkeley Road, De Pere, Wisconsin, 54115. Then off to the right, it says drive 3.2 miles, 6 minutes, or 6 min, M-I-N.
And again, in looking at the map, if you look at the highlighted route going from 1374 Hoffman Road to 2329 Berkeley Road, do you again see those drive statistics?
I do.
And what do those drive statistics indicate?
Drive statistics indicate the same that's on the top line. Drive it says 3.2 miles, and then 6 min, M-I-N, with a car next to it.
So would that mean to you that it's a 6-minute drive and a 3.2 mile drive?
Yes, based on my experience with Google, it is.
And then that would be speaking to the distance and the time associated with the highlighted route.
Correct.
Thank you. Sergeant Slinger, I'd like to move back to the Berkeley Road address. You're again familiar with that area?
Yes.
You've heard testimony in court about that neighborhood,
Yes.
the layout of that neighborhood,
Yes.
essentially where that neighborhood begins,
Yes.
what it's surrounded by?
Yes.
And you're aware that as part of this investigation, a drone was utilized to capture images of the area?
Yes.
And could you just tell us briefly, what is a drone?
Don't know a ton about them. It's like a remote control car, except it goes up in the air, and I guess they can be, cameras can be put on them, and they're controlled from a controller by someone on the ground.
And you're aware that one of those devices equipped with a camera was again used to portray the neighborhood of 2329 Berkeley Road?
Correct.
I'd ask that you look at exhibit number 97. And please describe what that appears to be.
97 appears to be an overhead view of the Berkeley Road neighborhood, more to the west, where it would intersect with County Highway GV. The Dietrich Vanderheiden residence would be the first one on the north side of the road on the left. There's a bunch of fields and things like that around the west of it and to the north of it. And then there are 10 or 11 cars parked out in the road in front of the residence.
And then again, this is the area that you know that drone was used?
Correct.
And are you aware that that drone actually recorded a video?
Yes.
And in looking at that document, does anything about that indicate that it's basically a still shot of a video?
Yes, it has the common play bar with with the fast forward and rewind and the volume controls, it would be seen on a computer screen, yes.
Okay, so you agree that this is an image, or it resembles an image that the drone would have taken when surveying this area?
Yes.
Judge, I'd ask for exhibit number 97 to be admitted to evidence and published for the jury.
Any objection to 97?
No objection.
Okay, 97 is admitted and can be published to the jury.
Sergeant Slinger, is this a portrayal of exhibit number 97?
Yes.
And again, you can see that play bar on the bottom?
Yes.
And this image appears to be taken from a video at 5 minutes and 37 seconds into the video.
Yes.
Could you please point out where the Dietrich residence is on this image?
Dietrich Vanderheiden residence is located right here.
Thank you. And again, you're aware of all the searches that were done of that residence?
Correct.
And you're aware of the canvassing of the neighborhood that occurred?
Correct.
No one ever searched that pond on the left, is that correct?
Correct.
No one ever searched that pond on the right, is that correct?
Correct.
On the far left, there appears to be closer to the road, a more significant creek. No one ever searched there either, correct?
Correct.
And but there was a dive team called out in this case, is that correct?
Correct.
And still, none of those areas were searched?
No, we searched there's a creek that you can hardly see on there that runs a little bit closer to the residence, and that area was all searched where, if you'd like, I could point it out to you.
Sure.
This area to the west of the residence here, there's a small little creek or waterway that would run back through here. So the dive team did go in here and search this immediate area with metal detectors and by hand.
Okay. And was that search done in part, do you recall, based on information a neighbor provided law enforcement?
I believe so. I'd have to go back through the reports to know exactly what was said, but yes, I believe so.
Does it sound familiar that a neighbor reported seeing a suspicious person walking towards that area? Objection,
That's it. What was the question again, Attorney Stebbins?
Well, essentially, Judge, I just asked if he recalls in review of his reports that an individual had approached law enforcement and informed them they saw a suspicious person walking towards that area.
Well, I don't think that necessarily calls for hearsay. I'll allow, overruled, you can answer that question.
Yes, that does sound correct.
And so, again, that area was searched,
Correct.
but none of the larger areas of water.
Correct. We had no other information to lead us to search those areas at that time.
Other than that, the murder scene is in close proximity.
Correct.
Sergeant Slinger, as far as you're aware, one moment, please, I apologize. I believe you said it might be helpful for you to review the report to know specifically what was conveyed to law enforcement?
Yes.
Okay. Judge, may I have permission to approach the witness?
You do?
Wish to approach?
Yes.
And just before I hand you this, you said you reviewed essentially all the statements in this case.
I did. Like I said, I can't for sure say, which is why I didn't want to speculate on what this statement might say.
So can I show you one of the
Absolutely.
statements? I'll just have you review that, not out loud.
You want that marked?
Yes.
Why don't we mark it in, could the court see that before you turn it over to Detective Step?
Your Honor, at this point, I mean, the state would remove its objection. This is hearsay. I mean, they're attempting to admit it for an alternative purpose, but also for the purpose of the truth of the matter asserted, when there are other options to accomplish that.
I'll just note it's not my intention to solicit any hearsay statements from Sergeant Slinger. I asked him if he recalled the reason why the dive team was called out there. He doesn't want to speculate. I just want him to review that and then ask him if he recalls why the dive team was out there.
All right, because any of this would be hearsay. So,
I intend on offering it as I just described, Judge.
all right, let's mark this as an exhibit, and you can present it to Detective Slinger.
a chance to review that?
I have.
And I'm not going to ask you any specifics about what any individual said, but after reviewing that statement, do you have a better recollection of why the dive team unit was called out to that area?
I do.
And was the dive team unit called out to that area because a neighbor reported observing a suspicious male walking towards that area?
Objection, Your Honor, this is exactly hearsay.
But now you're testifying to a statement that's clearly hearsay. I'm going to sustain the objection.
But, Your Honor, at this point, I'd rather have him just explain it by being able to answer. I mean, Mr. Stebbins is going to testify to information that's not in evidence. I'd at least like to have the officer explain, why the area was searched.
Go ahead.
So do you want me to refer to this?
Let's pull back for a second. Let's go back to question and answer. So I sustain the objection. You heard the district attorney's comments. Go ahead with your next question, Attorney Stebbins.
Why was the area searched?
The area was searched because we had information that there was potentially a suspicious person seen in the area of that creek walking. So we decided to take extra precaution and check that scene out.
When was that person seen?
May 21st.
At what time?
10 a.m.
Thank you. I have no further questions. May I retrieve the exhibit?
Go right ahead.
I guess you.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Sergeant, you're familiar with the area in which Nicole's body was found, is that correct?
Correct.
And based on officer's review of that scene, did it appear as if Nicole walked to that location?
No.
Did it appear that another individual walked from that location?
No.
Is there any indication in your review of all these materials that any part of this crime occurred on the East River?
No.
Is there any indication in your review of everything that this occurred in the East River Trail?
No.
We also saw an image of the Fox River. Is there any indication any part of this crime occurred in the Fox River?
No.
So you didn't search any of those locations?
We did not.
And with respect to, I believe it's Exhibit 98, statement which the defense just offered.
Yes.
That individual, was he able to identify the individual he observed?
He was not.
Okay. No further questions.
Any recross?
No, thank you, sir.
Detective Slinger, you may step down. Our next witness.
Call George Ryder. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your full name and spell your last name.
My name is Sergeant Jody Breider, B-R-E-I-D-E-R.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. How are you employed?
I'm an investigator with the Brown County Sheriff's Office.
How long have you been with the Brown County Sheriff's Office?
I've been in police work for 22 years, 16 with the Brown County Sheriff's Office.
And what is your present rank?
I'm a sergeant.
What are your duties?
I conduct investigations for the Brown County Sheriff's Office.
And were you working in that capacity in 2016?
Yes, I was.
And overall, do you have certain types of things that you investigate?
All crimes that I'm assigned to in Brown County.
Were you working on September 7th, 2016?
Yes, ma'am.
And approximately 6:24 a.m., did you respond to any certain area?
I responded to the area of West Mason and LeCount to assist with a custody arrest.
Of whom?
Mr. Burch?
George Burch?
Yes.
George Stephen Burch?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that person in the courtroom today?
Yes, he is.
Could you tell me where he's seated and what he's wearing?
He's to my right in a plaid-colored blue long-sleeve shirt.
And did you do anything, I'd ask the record to reflect identification of the defendant.
It will so reflect.
Did you do anything as far as surveillance prior to the actual arrest?
I did assist at one point with surveillance, and then I did assist with the arrest at the time that morning.
Was anything being secured while you were doing surveillance?
Yeah, I eventually did park outside of the residence and provided surveillance at that point to make sure the residence was secure that we eventually searched.
Did you arrive about 6:41 a.m.?
Yes, I did.
And at that point in time, you waited for the rest of your team to arrive, I take it?
Correct.
So, how long did you stay there?
I was there from 6:40 till 8:40. I had to return to the office to get some equipment, and then I returned back to the scene to assist with the search warrant that was served.
Did the arrest take place in your presence?
Yes.
And at what point in time was that?
That was before I went to the residence. That was earlier. That was at, I think, 6-something in the morning is when the arrest occurred. After that, I responded to the residence to assist with the search warrant.
Okay, thank you. And where is the search warrant being executed upon? What residence?
It was a 5/12 of 15th in the city of Green Bay.
Yes. Were others assisting you with respect to the search?
Yes, several other sergeants and a couple deputies also assisted.
Did someone approach and knock?
Yes,
Was there a response?
there was no response.
Were you able to enter?
Yes, we entered.
And how did you do that?
We had a key to enter the residence.
And was this about 10:29 a.m. that the warrant was being served?
Yes, ma'am.
And you and other sergeants and other officers entered at this point in time, is that correct?
Correct.
Exhibits 99, 100, and 101, if you just look, take time, go through those yourself if you would. When you were doing the search, did you wear certain clothing and gloves and so forth with respect to keeping the place non-contaminated with respect to evidence?
Yes, I wore a pair of gloves when I collected items.
And everyone else did as well, I take it?
That is correct.
So as far as assisting in the search, were there items recovered?
Yes.
With respect to exhibits that I just showed you, do you recognize what's being depicted in those photos?
Yes, it's a pair of white and blue Nike, like basketball-style shoes that I both photographed and eventually collected.
And in fact, those are seized from the residence itself, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Are they all the same shoe?
Yes,
And all three photos are of the same shoe, is that correct?
that is correct.
I'd ask that those exhibits be admitted at this point in time would be allowed to publish.
Subject to cross, any objection to 99, 100, and 101?
No, Judge.
All right. 99, 100, and 101 I received and may be published.
Thank you. Thank you. If you can see, sir, could you tell us which exhibit that would reflect? Is that 99?
That is number 99, correct?
Okay. And are those size 13 Air Jordans, those white and blue ones?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And then the next exhibit, would that be the bottoms of those same shoes?
That is correct.
And then that is exhibit what? What are you looking at this point in time?
That was 100.
Okay. And then 101? Would that be a close-up of those same shoes?
Yes, ma'am, 101.
And again, those are size 13, is that correct?
Yes.
Did you also seize some bags, such as an orange Reebok bag?
I seized an orange Reebok bag, correct.
Was there any mail in it addressed to any persons inside that bag?
There was a piece of mail that had the name George Burch on the mail.
Judge, may we approach?
Certainly.
Thank you. And then with respect to other items you seized or you observed, was there a green military bag?
Yes, there was.
Did that have a name on it?
It had the name Burch on it.
Okay. And did there appear to be a tag that indicated some travel that may have taken place, an itinerary or some sort?
Yes, there was an itinerary for the Greyhound bus, and I believe it was a destination in Virginia to Green Bay.
And with respect to that itinerary, would that have been Hampton, Virginia to Green Bay?
I don't remember specifically. I would have to see the picture of the tag.
Do you remember the arrival date?
June 24th of 16, I believe.
Okay, and did that tag also have a name on it with respect to that information?
I would have to see the tag to see if there was a name on it.
If I may approach, if you looked at your report, sir, would it refresh your memory perhaps with respect to the city and the name?
Yes. Okay, yeah, it does refresh my memory. It is Hampton, Virginia to Green Bay, Wisconsin, and the tag has George Burch's name on it.
I'm sorry, would you mark that? And then for the record, you just reviewed some details. Did you prepare those details, sir?
Yes, I did.
And you did it at a time closer in time than today, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And would that be Exhibit 105 that you just refreshed your memory with?
Yes, 105.
No further questions, thank you.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Sergeant Ryder. Sorry, Mr. Ryder. I would just briefly redirect your attention to exhibit number 99, and I'd ask that that be republished.
Let's put 99 up on the board. Oh, do we have, can we put 99 on the big screen, or do we have to distribute it?
I would just ask to make sure I'm on the same page. Could you please describe what exhibit 99 is again?
Yeah, it shows several pair of shoes, specifically the pair of white and blue Nike basketball stock.
I believe that was published.
That was, yeah, and you want it back on the screen, right?
Yes, please.
All right, let's, can we get it back on the screen? All right.
Is this exhibit number 99?
Correct.
And approximately how many different pairs of footwear would you say are in that image?
5 or possibly 6.
Okay. And you're aware that this residence was occupied by 2 adult males?
Correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Any redirect?
No redirect. I would like to clarify for the record, erroneously, there were 3 pictures that are just duplicates, just so we can keep things straight. They were marked exhibits 102, 103, and 104. They won't be offered, but just in case we wonder where those went.
All right.
Anything else? We ask this witness be excused.
You may be excused, Sergeant. Step down. Next witness.
State calls Kevin Scott.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your full name and spell your last name.
Kevin Scott, S-C-O-T-T.
Thank you.
Mr. Scott, if you get comfortable and just speak into those microphones in front of you. The attorney will say whenever you're ready.
Mr. Scott, can you state for the record how you are employed?
I am a DNA analyst at the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory in Madison.
How long have you been working in that capacity?
I've been there for about 5 years.
And what are the general duties of a DNA analyst?
I examine crime scene evidence for the possible presence of biological materials such as blood, semen, or saliva. I attempt to obtain DNA from these biological materials or from skin cells from touched items. I then analyze those DNA results and make comparisons between the items of evidence and standards that are taken from known individuals. I then prepare a written report of my laboratory findings and conclusions.
Mr. Scott, can you talk about your education and training that allow you to be a DNA analyst?
Yes, I received a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from UW-Madison. When I was hired at the lab, I received about 1 year of in-house training in every aspect of DNA analysis and use at the lab. And that included about 3 months of supervised casework training under a senior DNA analyst. In addition, I receive at least 8 hours of annual training.
Is the lab that you work for accredited, and what does that mean?
Yes, we are accredited by ASCLD Lab, which is the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors Lab Accreditation Board. Accreditation is a voluntary program in which we undergo a series of external audits in order to ensure that we are meeting established guidelines for forensic laboratories.
Can you estimate approximately how many different forensic DNA cases that you have worked on?
I've worked in the neighborhood of 320 cases.
And is there any way for you to estimate approximately how many DNA samples you've processed?
I've examined approximately 2,000 items of evidence. I don't know how many samples I've analyzed from all those.
Have you previously testified as an expert in Wisconsin courts?
Yes,
on
I've
DNA?
I've testified 8 times previously.
Mr. Scott, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 106. Are you able to identify that document?
Yes, this is my CV.
And does that appear to be a true and accurate copy of your CV?
Yes, it does.
I would move for the admission of that into evidence, Your Honor.
So did you cross any objection?
None, Judge.
Okay. 106, his CV is admitted.
Mr. Scott, before we get started with any sort of specifics, can you explain to the jury what DNA is?
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the genetic material that is present in all living organisms. It is essentially the blueprint that codes for all structures and functions within your body. DNA is found in nearly every cell of your body, and you get half of your DNA from your mother and half from your father.
Is an individual's DNA the same throughout their body?
Yes, in one individual, no matter the source of that particular DNA sample, your DNA will be the same, whether it's from skin cells or saliva or blood.
And you mentioned earlier that it's found in every cell throughout your body. What are the common sources of DNA that you would typically detect?
Good sources of DNA would be from blood, semen, and saliva, bodily fluids. Also, sometimes skin cells from items that have been handled can also be a good source of DNA.
You hear the term touch DNA. What does that mean?
Touch DNA generally refers to DNA left behind on an object after it has been handled by an individual.
Does merely touching something guarantee that DNA will be left behind?
Mr. Scott, I just remind you, the jury has to hear your answer, so either a little louder or speak closer into the microphones, all right? Thank you.
Judge, maybe it'll help. The microphone is actually the square one in front. It's not the one you pulled.
No, just if you touch an object, there's no guarantee that you leave behind enough DNA for us to be able to detect. There are several factors that can influence how much DNA is left behind, such as how long the object is handled, or the duration, or the how much handling that object actually has. Certain individuals will can leave are good sources of DNA, or certain individuals leave behind more DNA than other individuals, so that can also influence it.
I asked whether an individual's DNA was the same throughout the body, and you indicated that it was. Why is that important?
When we analyze an item of evidence, we attempt to obtain DNA from that item of evidence, and that DNA can come from pretty much any source from your body. When we make comparisons to known individuals, we make a comparison typically to a buccal swab, which is a swab of your inside cheek. Since all of your DNA is the same throughout your body, we can be guaranteed that that swab, or the DNA that we obtain from that swab, is the same as any other source of DNA that you may have left behind.
And is one person's DNA different from another person's?
Yes, any two individuals should have different DNA, or will have different DNA, with the exception of identical siblings or identical twins. These differences in your DNA can occur at known genetic markers. So when we analyze DNA, we analyze the DNA at these specific markers where it's known to differ between two different individuals.
Mr. Scott, I again advise you to just speak up a little louder so the jury can hear you.
What are chromosomes?
Chromosomes are what would, I guess, contain your DNA in your cells. Every individual has 23 pairs of chromosomes.
And what are some of the genetic markers that you look for? Can you describe what a genetic marker is? You used the term before, that they have different genetic
So
markers.
these genetic markers are specific locations on the chromosomes that we test for DNA. We have two different kinds of tests that we can perform. One would be an autosomal test, which would look at 15 genetic markers located across, I guess, 15 different or several different chromosomes. In addition, we also have a test that only looks at markers located on the Y chromosome. Now, females would have two X chromosomes, males would have an X and a Y chromosome. So when we do this Y chromosome testing, that would only look at male DNA in a particular sample.
What is one reason why Y chromosome may be analyzed separately from the standard testing?
So the standard DNA testing that we might employ would be the autosomal test. That is the test that would attempt to analyze all human DNA, whether it's female or male, in a particular sample. In certain cases, there might be a very small amount of male DNA and a very large amount of female DNA. If we were to attempt this autosomal test with a very large amount of female DNA, we might only generate a female profile, and the male DNA might be masked. Since we have this Y chromosome testing, this Y analysis, we can test that sample for just the Y chromosome, so it essentially ignores all of the female DNA in the sample.
Essentially allows you to isolate the male DNA that would be available.
That's correct.
Are there limitations to YSTR DNA in comparison to autosomal DNA?
Yes, there are. When we perform the autosomal testing, we generate a DNA profile. So this DNA profile is essentially a list of numbers at these 15 genetic markers that represent a person's or an individual's DNA. Now, any two individuals should, with the exception of identical twins, will have a different DNA profile, a different autosomal DNA profile. Now, with the Y chromosome testing, we also generate a Y profile, which is the list of numbers that represent the 23 genetic markers that we analyze on the Y chromosome. However, that Y profile is not necessarily unique to any one individual. Two different male individuals can share the same Y profile. In particular, paternally related male individuals, such as two individuals who share a father-son relationship, should share the same Y profile.
Can the YSTR profile used to eliminate potential individuals from being a source of DNA?
Yes, if I generate a Y profile from an item of evidence, and I make comparisons to a male individual's Y profile, if those two profiles do not match, then that male individual is eliminated or excluded as the possible source of that evidentiary Y profile.
When you are making a comparison with a Y profile generated from a piece of evidence and a Y profile from a known source, if you determine that those are the same, then what would your conclusion typically be at that point?
So if I generate an evidentiary Y profile and I make a comparison to a male standard, and those two Y profiles match, I would then perform a statistical analysis in order to provide an estimate of how common that Y profile might be in the general population.
You said male standard, you mean that's a known YSTR profile that you have?
Correct. Like a buckle standard taken from a known individual, that would generate an autosomal profile and a Y profile from a male individual in order to make comparisons.
As part of your duties with the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, did you become involved with an investigation into the death of Nicole Vanderheiden at the request of the Brown County Sheriff's Office?
That's correct.
Do you recall roughly when you first began working on this case?
May 26, 2016.
Is that the first date that you conducted analysis, or is that the date that you first found out about the case?
I believe that's the date that the Madison Crime Lab first received some evidence for some DNA analysis.
Do you recall which items you were asked to analyze first?
Yes, I do.
And what are those?
There were several items.
Can you talk a little bit about the crime lab's policy in terms of receiving items and testing items? Can an agency, for example, just simply send every item they have that might have evidentiary value and ask you to test all of it?
Not necessarily, no. In order to limit the number of items that the lab takes in, just as part of a resource management perspective, we have a set of submission guidelines that we ask agencies to follow. In homicide cases, we would ask the agency, the submitting agency being the Sheriff's Department, to limit their first submission of evidence to 10 items. At the conclusion of the analysis on those 10 items, they would be free to continue to submit more items and so on.
And in a more serious case, in a homicide case, are you often in contact with the law enforcement agency regarding the items that would be sent?
Yes, that's correct. If we know that the law enforcement agency has a large number of items, we might be in contact with them in order to determine which items might be the most probative or the most relevant to the case, so we could start with those first.
And determining what you test is not just based on resources, but also based on the potential evidentiary value of the items and strategical concerns.
That's correct, yes.
Strategical meaning that it would be important to prioritize the items that might have the most value.
That's correct.
Do you know how many reports you generated in this particular case?
Yes, I believe it was 9 reports.
Do you recall how many total items of evidence that you tested in this case?
If my count was correct, I tested 78 items of evidence and 13 standards.
And over what time period?
Most of the testing was performed over the summer of 2016. There were additional 5 items that were recently tested.
In comparison to the average case at the crime lab, is 78 items a lot of items?
I would say that would be a lot of items, yes.
Now, in terms of walking you through your testimony, because you have so many different reports, I ask you to show the reports and describe the items of significance within those reports, and we'll go one by one. But before we go through the reports, I just want to convey, the reports are chronological in terms of the date that you generated them. Is that always consistent with the chronology in which you tested the items?
Not necessarily. I would, as I tested the items, I might group my report or group the items that I report on into different reports depending on what the results are, depending on the item, just whatever would make sense.
And we'll note in a moment that your first report is on July 19th of 2016. However, were you providing information to the Brown County Sheriff's Office about your outcomes prior to generating that first report?
Yes, that's correct. I provided verbal reports to the Brown County Sheriff's Office as I was analyzing these items of evidence prior to generating the final written report.
And what is the purpose of providing some of that evidence or some of that information orally to the Sheriff's Office rather than just generating the report?
Sometimes if that case is time sensitive, or if the agency needs that information for any particular reason, we might, in order to save some time, just verbally provide the results rather than in the written report. However, even if we do provide the verbal results, we still provide a written report at some point.
So if there's information that you shared with the law enforcement agency, you would eventually put that down in a written form in a report?
That's correct, yes.
Scott, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 107. Can you identify that document?
Yes, this is a report that I authored dated July 19th, 2016.
And do you know approximately how many different items are indicated on that report?
I mean, I could count, but I'd guess between 30 and 40.
Quite a few.
Yeah.
Correct. And again, many of those, all of those items would have been analyzed in some capacity prior to July 19th?
That's correct. This is just the, July 19th is just the date that the final report was issued. All of the items were analyzed prior to that.
I would draw your attention first to page 3 of the documents, and specifically draw your attention to items E and F on the top of that page. Your Honor, I actually would offer this exhibit into evidence and ask for permission to publish it.
I think that makes sense. Subject to cross, any objection to? Is that 107? Any objection to 107?
No, thank you.
All right. 107 is received and it can be published so everyone can read along on the big screen.
Come up. I was going to ask you about page 3, but first I'd ask you to look at page 1. Can you identify what items E and F are?
Yes, item E and F are both swabs reportedly from garage.
And in terms of the names that are given to a particular item in a report, where do you generate that name?
So the item E and F designations are crime laboratory item designations. So when we first receive an item into the lab, the first item received would be item A, next item would be item B, and so on. The description of the items is simply what the agency would provide to us. So these particular swabs, I was not present when they were taken. I was informed that they were taken from a garage.
And on page 3 of your report, do you make any conclusions about items E and F?
Yes, human blood was not detected from those swabs.
And can you describe the process that you used to determine that human blood was not detected on those swabs?
Yes, so we have a couple of different tests that we use in order to test for the presence of blood. One of these tests is called a hemotrace test, and it uses, or it's an antibody immunological test, similar to a pregnancy test. So we take our sample, place it onto a little card, and depending on the results from that card, it would indicate whether or not blood was present on that, in that item. So this test, it's designed to test for human blood. There are a couple other animals, such as like primates, that also produce a positive test, but these two items were negative. So there was no human blood present on these swabs.
And for that reason, no further analysis was done on those swabs?
That's correct. I didn't attempt to obtain any DNA from the swabs.
If you could return to page 1, I would ask you to look at item D, and do you recall what item D is?
Item D was a shirt, like a dress shirt.
And you know, so you added some additional information. Do you recall specifically what item D was?
I believe it was recovered from a hamper or something at the residence.
And did you do any testing with respect to item D?
Yes, I tested item D for the possible presence of blood. I examined the item and tested any any stains that looked like it could be blood on the shirt. All of these tests were negative. I therefore reported that blood was not detected on the shirt. And I did not perform any additional analysis after that.
And you looked over the shirt yourself before determining areas where testing might be needed?
That's correct. Yes, I examined it.
And you did not visually see any items that looked like blood?
Any items that I did see, I tested, and all those tests were negative.
I would call your attention to items J1 and J2. What are those items?
Those are a set of Air Jordan shoes.
And drawing your attention to page 3, there's a discussion of the Air Jordan shoes. What type of analysis was conducted on those shoes?
I examined those shoes and attempted to test for the possible presence of blood. After that, I also took some swabbings on for DNA.
Specific to J2, did you observe any presence of blood on item J2?
So item J2 was the right Air Jordan shoe. All of the tests that I performed on J2 were negative, so I concluded that blood was not detected on item J2.
And then with respect to J1, did you test that also for the potential presence of blood?
Yes, I did. So this the test that I performed on these shoes is a color change test. That is, if it's a positive reaction, it's an indication for the possible presence of blood. So when I examined these shoes, I tested any brown coloring on the shoes that looked like they could be blood. On all these tests, if I perform this this reaction, and if there is no color change, that would be a negative reaction, so there is no blood. If blood is present on an item, that test would change bright pink very quickly. So on the item J1, the left Air Jordan shoe, most of those tests that I performed for the possible presence of blood were negative. However, one test I called inconclusive. It did turn pink, however slowly, and not in the manner that I would expect blood to turn pink. I then took that swab, that inconclusive swab, on for DNA in order to see if any DNA was present, and I did not detect enough DNA on that inconclusive swab to warrant further testing.
So with respect to one shoe, there was no presence of blood in any of the areas you looked at. With respect to the other shoe, no presence of blood in all of the tests except one, but in one of the tests it was inconclusive.
That's correct.
And because it was inconclusive, you then chose to do follow-up testing using DNA swabbing.
That's correct.
Typically, in your experience, if there is actually a visual stain of blood, would that blood typically result in sufficient DNA for testing?
If it's human blood, typically, yes.
And when you did the follow-up test on that particular swab, there was not a sufficient amount of DNA for any sort of testing?
That's correct.
Okay, we'll say it's been almost an hour and a half now with the jury. Why don't we take our afternoon break? We'll begin again at 3:25 and go until the conclusion of the day.
All rise. And the results for those shoes, were they also negative for the presence of blood?
That's correct. I did not detect blood from those items.
And what type of testing did you use to make that determination?
I used our presumptive test for the possible presence of blood. That is the color change test. I should clarify that this is a presumptive test for the possible presence of blood. If it changes to bright pink, that just means that that blood could be present. There are some substances out there that could induce a false color change. However, if there is no color change, then blood is definitely not present.
So while there could potentially be false positives, you're not likely to see false negatives.
That's correct.
Item S on July 19th, 2016 report is a paper towel that was provided to you by the Brown County Sheriff's Office. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And did you
Let's
look?
say, excuse me, did you want that published again?
If I could, Your Honor.
And do you have a copy for me? Because it's hard for me to still see everything. Hard copy? If you don't, that's fine. But why don't, for the jury, let's get get that exhibit published again. Can we get it up on the screen, Attorney Saunders? All right.
Page 2 of that report. On the very bottom paragraph, it actually indicates that there was a presumptive test for possible presence of blood, which was positive for several different items. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That included blood staining on left and hand fingernails, paper toweling, a shoe, which is item AF, and is that a shoe believed to belong to Nicole Vanderheiden?
That's correct.
Also pants, again, were those an item that was believed to belong to Nicole Vanderheiden?
That's correct.
And underwear, again, an item believed to belong to Nicole Vanderheiden?
Correct.
You indicated you did not perform a confirmatory test on those items. Can you explain that?
Yes, typically I would not perform a confirmatory test unless it was absolutely needed to know if blood was present on the item. Typically, if we get a positive test, that's a good indication of the possible presence of blood. I would then go take a sample from that item and go directly onto DNA analysis.
So while you did not confirm the presence of blood, you then went on and tested those items for the presence of DNA.
That's correct.
And specifically with respect to the paper towel item S, were you able to develop an autosomal profile from that item?
That's correct. I developed a male profile.
So that was positive for the presence of male blood?
I developed a male profile from DNA on there.
And did you compare that to known samples that you had?
That's correct.
And were all the known samples provided to you excluded?
That's correct. None of the known standards that I received matched that male profile. So every standard that I received was excluded as the possible source of that male profile.
And on page 2, it actually lists items C, G, K, AP, AQ, and AR. Are those the buccal swab standards that you compared the blood from the paper towel to?
In addition to the dried blood standard from Nicole, that's correct, yes.
And all of those individuals were excluded and were not the source of the blood that was on the paper towel that had been turned over to you?
Not the source of the male DNA that I detected, yes.
I apologize. I used blood and DNA interchangeably, and I should not do that. Were you also asked to do a presumptive test for the presence of blood on swabs from a trunk lid?
I received 3 sets of swabs from a trunk lid, that's correct.
And did those come from the state crime lab in Wausau?
I do not believe so.
Did you know where those were from?
They were submitted directly by the Brown County Sheriff's Office.
And those items were negative for the presence of blood?
That's correct.
Then with respect to items N and O, on page 1 of the report, those items were the cable that was sent to you by the Brown County Sheriff's Office?
That's correct. These were 2 sections of a cable, or 2
And what-
pieces.
Sorry, and what testing did you do on that cable?
So when I received this cable, there looked to be some reddish-brown staining on both the pieces of cable that looked like blood to me. I tested that staining, and I identified the presence of blood on both sections of cable. I then took 3 sets of swabbings from each section of the cable, so 6 swabbings in all, in order to attempt to develop detect any DNA that was present on the cable.
And were you able to detect DNA on the cable?
Yes, I was.
And what were the results of that testing? Draw your attention, I think, to page 5 of the report for the autosomal conclusions.
So these are the autosomal conclusions. This is the DNA profile that I would develop from any human DNA, both male and female, on that particular on these particular samples. 3 of the swabbings of the 1 section of cable, item N, I developed a female profile that matched the profile I detected from Nicole. I therefore concluded that Nicole was the source of the DNA from those 3 swabbings. 2 of the swabbings of the other section of cable, item O, also I detected a female profile that matched Nicole, so I concluded that Nicole was also the source of the DNA from those 2 swabbings. In 1 swabbing, I detected a partial female profile. So I should back up and say that when I say that somebody is the source of a particular autosomal profile, that simply means that their profile matches the profile that I detected from the evidence. When that happens, I perform a statistical analysis on the evidentiary profile in order to estimate how rare, common that profile would be in the general population. If that profile is more rare than 1 in 7 trillion individuals, which is approximately 1,000 times the world's population, I would report that that individual is the source of the DNA profile that I detected. If it's less rare than 1 in 7 trillion, I would report out the statistic. So in this particular swabbing, the O1 swabbing at the bottom of page 5, that partial female profile from the swabbing of the cable matched the profile from Nicole with a statistic of approximately 1 in 90 million.
So of the 6 swabbings that you took from the 2 sections of cable, Nicole was the source on 5 of those 6 swabbings? Is that
That's correct.
And on the 6th swabbing, Nicole was included as a possible source for that DNA, and the odds of finding another unrelated individual is 1 in 90 million.
More or less, that's correct.
And the other individuals for whom you had buccal swab standards at that point were excluded from being the source on O1?
That's correct.
That would include Douglas Dietrich?
That's correct. Douglas Dietrich was excluded as the possible source of that autosomal profile that I developed.
And from what you recall, could you describe what that cable was?
It was just like a black, small cable, maybe like a charging cord or something like that.
Mr. Scott, I'm showing you what have been marked as Exhibits 23 and Exhibit 79. Can you take a look at both of those items?
Okay.
And do those items appear to be consistent with the item that you were calling the cable?
Yes, that's correct.
And in fact, they do have tags on them, which are crime lab tags, is that right?
It would appear so, yes.
Not from your lab, from a different lab, is that right?
Correct. I did not place those tags on there.
When you're calling the item a cable, it's been called a cord, but it's consistent with what you viewed here in these 2 exhibits.
That's correct.
Did you also conduct YSTR testing on that particular cable?
Yes, I did. So when I examine an item of evidence, I might attempt to obtain DNA from that item by taking a swabbing of the item. So I just rub a large Q-tip essentially over the surface of the item in order to transfer as much DNA from the item to the swab as I can. I then attempt to release the DNA from any cells on that swabbing, and then I quantitate the sample in order to determine how much DNA is present in the sample. Now, when I quantitate this, I can tell how much human DNA and how much male DNA is present on that sample. Or I can estimate how much human DNA and how much male DNA is present. In all 6 of these swabbings, there was a very small amount of male DNA present. I chose one of the swabbings, the N3 swabbing, I believe, in order to test for Y chromosome analysis, because that particular swabbing had the most male DNA that I detected.
And were you able to develop a profile from that swab eventually?
Yes, I was able to obtain a partial YSTR profile from that swab.
I'll draw your attention to page 11 of this report. And near the bottom, there is a discussion of your Y profile results relative to that particular item. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you indicate there that it is consistent with Y profile 1. Is that right?
That's correct.
Can you describe what Y profile 1 was at that point in time?
So in this first round of testing, I tested a number of items, including several swabs taken from Nicole's body. And on many of these items, there was a Y profile that was popping up on many of the items. In order to make this more clear in my report, I called this Y profile 1. So this partial YSTR profile that I developed from the swabbing of the cable was consistent with that Y profile 1.
And that was a profile that you had noted on several different swabs in this case, including several of the swabs taken from Nicole's body.
That's correct.
Also note that at that point, based on the Y profile that you developed, you were able to exclude Douglas Dietrich, Gregory Matthew, Dylan Vanderheiden, Tyler Vanderheiden, and Brian Vanderheiden from being the source of the Y profile on that section of cable?
That's correct. That partial Y profile that I developed did not match the Y profiles that I developed from those male individuals. They are excluded as a possible source of that male DNA.
I'm going to draw your attention back to page 5 of the report where we were talking about conclusions you made with respect to autosomal profiles. You located, you noted earlier that Nicole Vanderheiden was the source of the DNA detected from several items. One of those items was the sections of cable that we talked about before. Was Nicole also the source of the swabs taken from the street, which would have been the street outside of her residence on Berkeley Road?
That's correct. I developed a female profile from item L, which are the swabs from the street that matched Nicole's profile. So Nicole is the source of that DNA.
And likewise, you were able to determine that Nicole was the source of the DNA on several different clothing items that have been provided to you with that transmittal. Is that correct?
That's correct.
There was a shoe, interior and exterior waistband of pants, as well as some staining on the pants, and the interior waistband and cutting of staining on the underwear. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Nicole was the source of the DNA on those items.
Yes. The source of the autosomal profile that I detected, correct.
Thank you. Were you able to develop any autosomal STR profiles of males based on the items that are reported on in the July 19th, 2016 report?
I believe so, yes.
In addition to the standards, of course. Obviously, you have the standards, but was a male autosomal STR profile found on any of the items?
Yes, I believe so.
fact, some of the items that you tested, including a Fitbit that was sent to you, believed to belong to Doug Dietrich?
Yes, that's correct. I took a couple of swabbings from that Fitbit.
And Doug was the source of the male DNA on the Fitbit?
Yes, I took a swabbing of the exterior of the Fitbit, so the side that would face up, like away from your skin, as well as a swabbing of the interior side of the Fitbit. I developed a male profile from that swabbing of the interior. It matched Douglas. I concluded that Douglas Dietrich is the source of that DNA. I developed a mixture profile from the swabbing of the exterior of the Fitbit. So a mixture profile is just a DNA profile that contains DNA from more than one individual. So this mixture profile was a mixture of DNA from at least 2 individuals, and one of those individuals contributed more DNA to that mixture than any other individual, and I was able to determine the single source profile from that male individual who contributed the most DNA to that mixture. That major male contributor matched Douglas Dietrich, so I concluded that Douglas Dietrich is the source of the major male contributor DNA detected from the swabbing of the exterior of the Fitbit. Then there was, I cannot make any conclusions on the minor component or the component from any second person in that mixture.
You also had several swabs of a cell phone that had been turned over to you that was indicated to potentially belong to Nicole, is that correct?
That's correct.
And were you able to, I'll draw your attention to page 6 of your report. On page 6 of your report, specifically swabbing AG1, which is of the phone, you were able to develop a mixture of DNA, is that correct?
That's correct. So this AG1 swabbing was a swabbing of the outer edges of the phone. I developed a mixture of DNA from at least 3 contributors, and at least one of those 3 was a male contributor. I was able to call a major mixture component, which is essentially the contribution of DNA from the top 2 contributors to that mixture, so the 2 individuals who contributed the most DNA. Nicole and Dylan were both included as possible contributors to that major mixture component, with a statistic of approximately 1 in 140 million. Then I was unable to make any conclusions to the low-level minor component, that third person in there.
So with respect to that mixture, Nicole's son Dylan was included as a possible contributor, is that correct?
That's correct.
And with respect to that mixture, the other males, including Douglas Dietrich, were excluded as possible contributors to the mixture on the phone.
Excluded as possible contributors to the major mixture component, that's correct.
And you noted similar results, perhaps different statistics, but basically the inclusion of Dylan and the exclusion of the other males with respect to 2 other swabs from that phone?
More or less, that's correct, yes.
And back to this notion of developing a Y profile 1, from an investigative standpoint, once you've started to develop the same Y profile over and over again on a body or on a source, what are you potentially starting to look for from an investigative standpoint?
Could you clarify that?
Sure. So the Y profile not suitable for comparison, is that correct? With known standards or with not with known standards, excuse me, with databases?
Yeah, so typically when we work a case, our goal is to obtain an autosomal profile that can be used for comparisons. This autosomal a foreign autosomal profile could be searched in a database against other individuals that are in that database. However, Y profiles cannot be searched in that way. We cannot search a database in order to get a name or anything. So while these Y profiles might be useful in an investigative standpoint, they can't be searched. So therefore, unless I have a standard from a known individual to make a direct comparison to that Y standard or to that Y profile, it's not necessarily we need to perform additional work in order to try to obtain this autosomal profile.
So is it true that at some point as you were testing the additional swabs, you start looking for any items that will give you that potential autosomal profile that can be used for comparison with a database?
That would be correct, yes.
Mr. Scott, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 108. Can you identify what that document is?
This Exhibit 108 is a report, or a copy of a report that I authored dated August 10th, 2016.
All right, move for revision of that exhibit and ask that it be published.
Subject to cross, any objection to 108?
No, thank you.
108 is received, to be published on the big screen.
And the August 10th report lists a number of different items that were tested. Are most of those swabs from the body of Nicole Vanderheiden?
That's correct.
And those items are listed on page 1 of the report, which will be up shortly.
That's correct.
With respect to your conclusions of testing of those items on autosomal profiles, were you able to make any conclusions?
I don't believe I developed any autosomal profiles from those swabs from Nicole's body.
And the other items that are listed, AH1 and AH2, those items were re-examined. Those were things that we had already talked about on the July 19th of 2016 report.
Yes, the pants and the underwear, that's correct.
What was the purpose of the re-examination?
Just to take further samples from those items. I had originally taken some swabbings of staining and of the waistband areas, so I just performed additional analysis. I took some more swabbings and looked for some hairs and that sort of thing.
And with respect to, I'll go to page 4 of the report, looking at a number of the items that were collected from swabs of Nicole's body, you were able to again make some YSTR DNA conclusions on those items?
That's correct. So these swabs from the body, when I extracted them for DNA, I detected a large amount of female DNA in most of them and a very small amount of male DNA on most of them. So I did not attempt to perform any autosomal testing. I did, however, attempt to perform the YSTR DNA testing.
And again, looking at several of the items on page 4, a swab from the right arm, swab from the left arm, swab from the mons pubis, swab from the left palm, all listed on page 4. You were again able to develop a profile that was consistent with the Y profile 1.
That's correct.
And again, at that time, no autosomal profile that was suitable for comparison with a national database.
That's correct.
The other exhibit that I put in front of you, I believe, is at 109.
Yep.
Could you identify what that document is?
Exhibit 109 is another report that I authored, dated August 22nd, 2016.
And what are the items that are discussed in that particular report?
These are 2 socks, item BJ and BK.
And the date of that report?
This is August 22nd, 2016.
Were you able to develop a usable male autosomal profile from the analysis of the socks?
So when I examined these socks, I took a swabbing of the exterior of the socks, trying to transfer any DNA that was on the sock to my swab for analysis. When I quantitated these swabbings, there was a large amount of female DNA. However, there was also enough male DNA for me to attempt autosomal testing. For the swabbing of one sock, the item BJ, the swabbing was BJ1, I developed an autosomal mixture of DNA from at least 2 individuals, and that mixture included at least 1 male contributor. One of those individuals contributed more DNA to the mixture than the other, and I was able to determine a major female contributor profile. That major female contributor profile matched the profile from Nicole. I therefore concluded that Nicole was the source of the major female contributor DNA. There was also a minor component to this mixture, which I was able to use for inclusionary purposes, so I'm able to make comparisons to that mixture profile.
The report is dated August 22nd, 2016, but again, that's not the date of the testing, is that correct?
That's correct. All this testing occurred prior to the date of the final report.
And once you obtained a profile that was suitable for comparison with a data bank, what did you do?
I should also mention that I also performed YSTR testing on this particular swabbing. And I also developed a mixture profile with a major Y profile that matched this Y profile 1. At this point, I went back to the autosomal mixture profile, and I entered this, the minor component of this mixture profile into the database in order to search for any other profiles that might match.
And were you aware that a hit developed in a national database?
Yes, a hit did develop.
And that was out of the state of Virginia?
That's correct.
And when you learned that the profile that you had developed from the mixture on the sock came back with a hit, what did you do at that point?
What did I do, or the lab?
Sorry, what did the lab do? I apologize.
So when a hit like this occurs, the state that it occurred to will provide the information of the individual who had hit you to our lab. Our lab would then provide that name to the investigating agency, in this case the Brown County Sheriff's Department. It's just a name, an investigative lead for the Brown County Sheriff to follow up on.
So when you get a hit in a database, that is not to be used as a definitive testing conclusion. It's basically to be used as an investigative lead.
That's correct.
And do you know the name of the individual who came back as a potential match?
I believe the report said George Burch.
And that report was provided to the Brown County Sheriff's Office?
That's correct.
Do you know the date of that report?
I believe it was, I want to say August 19th, 2016.
And with the exhibit that's in front of you, 109, with respect to the mixture on the sock, was Doug Dietrich excluded from the possible contributor to that autosomal profile?
Yes, that's correct. Douglas Dietrich was excluded as a possible contributor to that mixture profile.
Your Honor, I would move for admission of that exhibit. I don't intend to publish it, but I'll move for admission.
And that's 109, Mr. Scott? It's 109.
Oh, that's correct, yes.
All right, any objection to 109 subject to cross?
No, thank you.
Okay. 109 is received, and you don't want it published at this time, is that right?
Correct. Mr. Scott, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 110. Take a look at that and describe what it is.
This is a report that I authored dated September 12th, 2016.
And in that report, you had at that point received a buccal swab standard reportedly recovered from George Burch.
That's correct.
And the purpose of this report primarily was to compare the standard you received from Mr. Burch with other items where you had previously developed a profile. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Your Honor, I would move for admission of this exhibit and ask that it be published.
Any objection to 110 subject to cross?
No, thank you.
All right, 110 will be received, and we can publish it for the jury.
I'll draw your attention to page 2 at the top of the page. Were you able to make any conclusions with respect to whether Mr. Burch was included as a possible contributor to that STR DNA mixture detected from the sock item BJ?
Yes, George Burch is included as a possible contributor to the mixture profile that I had detected from the swabbing of the one sock item BJ. Given that DNA from Nicole is present on our own sock, it's at least 574 trillion times more likely to observe that mixture profile if it's a mixture of DNA from Nicole and Mr. Burch than if it's a mixture of DNA from Nicole and a random unrelated individual.
Now, you testified earlier about the use of the term source with respect to DNA, and I believe you gave a statistic that in some instances, I guess when there's not a mixture, you indicate that a person is the source if the odds of it being someone else are 1 in 7 trillion. Is that right?
That's correct.
With respect to mixtures, do you give the source connotation?
Generally not, unless there's a major contributor. That source connotation is generally solely for a comparison between two single source profiles, so the standard and a single source evidentiary profile. In this particular case, this is a mixture profile, and George Burch is included as a possible contributor to that mixture profile. I ran what is called a likelihood ratio in this case, which is a ratio of two probabilities. One probability being that this is a mixture of DNA from Nicole and George Burch. The other probability being a mixture of DNA from Nicole and a random unrelated individual. So it is at least 574 trillion times more likely to observe this mixture profile if it's from Nicole and George Burch than if it's a mixture of DNA from Nicole and a random individual.
Based on your experience, is that a strong statistical correlation?
Yes, I would say it's a very strong, or extremely strong match.
Using the autosomal STR conclusions, were there a number of instances where Mr. Burch was excluded as a possible contributor to items that have been previously tested?
That's correct.
And those items for which Mr. Burch was excluded are listed on page 2 of that report, is that correct?
That's correct.
And what are the items for which Mr. Burch was excluded as a possible contributor?
He was excluded as the possible contributor to that partial female profile that I detected from one swabbing of the item O cable. He was excluded as the possible source of the female, of a female profile that I detected from a swabbing from a car that I don't believe we've covered. He is excluded as the source of the male profile that I detected from the cutting of the paper towel, and as well as some other swabbings that we haven't discussed.
Items essentially that were either Nicole's items, looks like her shoes, her purse, the edges, back and screen of her phone, and the clasp area and general exterior of her wallet. He was excluded from the STR profiles that you developed from those items?
From the autosomal profiles, that's correct.
Thank you. And I also appreciate the reminder. You indicated that there was an item, a swab taken from a car. That's item B15. I believe that is actually referenced in the very first report that we talked about, the July 19th of 2016 report. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Could you return to that exhibit? You have that in front of you, Mr. Scott?
Yes, I do.
So right on page 1, there's item B15, which is a swab reportedly from a stain at marker 17 from a car. That was the swab taken from the Buick Rendezvous.
I'm not sure what car it was. I believe the Wausau lab analyzed that car. I wasn't involved in that.
And the swab taken from that vehicle was tested for the presence of blood. Did you locate the presence of blood on that particular swab?
Yes, blood was identified on that swab.
And was Nicole Vanderheiden included as a possible contributor to that swab?
No, Nicole was excluded as the possible source of that, of the female profile that I developed from that swab.
And again, to reiterate, when you indicate inclusions, that creates a statistical probability, but when you indicate exclusions, you're definitively saying that person as excluded as the possible contributor of that particular DNA source.
That's correct, yes.
All right, I'd like to return then to the more recent exhibit, the September 12th of 2016 report. Were you able to, in addition to the autosomal STR DNA conclusions, make a number of YSTR DNA conclusions?
Yes, that's correct.
You talked earlier about Y profile 1. When were you able to develop a YSTR profile from the buccal swab of Mr. Burch?
Yes, I did.
And was his profile consistent with YSTR1, the Y profile 1 that you had identified earlier?
Yes, the profile the Y profile that I detected from George Burch is consistent with the Y profile 1 that I had detected from the items of evidence.
And again, Mr. Scott, earlier you had indicated that when you are talking about the name of a particular swab, that name is the one given to you by the law enforcement agency. Is that accurate?
That is correct. I'm going by the labeling on the packaging that we receive.
So on page 3 of this report, you list the YSTR DNA profile detected from George Burch and the items with which it is consistent. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. And it should be noted that each of these have a statistic associated with it as well.
Correct. And you do specifically later in the report break down the statistical numbers that are associated with each of those conclusions.
That's correct, yes.
And in fact, some are stronger than the others. Is that right?
That's correct.
What is the basis for the difference in the statistical conclusions? Why would it be more statistically likely on one item than it is on another?
So with the YSTR statistical analysis that we perform, we query a database with that evidentiary Y profile that we develop in order to see how many times that particular Y profile is in the database. This is not the same database that we were speaking about before. This is simply a database that will return the amount of times that this profile has been seen. And we use that in order to provide an estimate of how common that Y profile might be in the population. These Y profiles can vary, or the number of genetic markers that we obtain from the evidentiary samples might vary. We're talking generally about very small amounts of male DNA, so we might not obtain all 23 genetic markers that we test for. So if we only obtain 22 genetic markers, that number might differ, or the statistical analysis might differ from the 22 genetic markers versus the 23 genetic markers.
So while there may be different statistical conclusions for each of these items, is it fair to say that each of these items do all share commonalities? Which is essentially they're all consistent with George Burch's profile.
That's correct.
Mr. Scott, I'll have you just sort of run through the list here on page 3. Put a green symbol everywhere that is consistent with what you have indicated in your conclusions as an area on the body where a profile is detected that's consistent with Mr. Burch. The first one listed.
Can we approach real quick?
Sure. And what is that 110? Page 3 of 110?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. All right, our sidebar was just to clarify something with the subsequent questions. So again, this is page 3 of Exhibit 110, and that exhibit number, the chart, is what Attorney was saying?
It is exhibit number 22.
Okay, 22 is presented to the jury. You may continue with your question. Thank you.
Actually, Your Honor, before I mark on this, what I would purport to do is have one of the deputies take a photograph of 22 prior to it having any markings on it, because I'm going to change the exhibit, and then they can take another photograph after it's been marked so that we can document that.
Any objection to that procedure?
No, that makes sense.
No, that's appropriate. Let's do that.
Mr. Scott, the first item listed is YSTR DNA profile detected from George Burch is consistent with the YSTR DNA profile previously detected from the non-sperm fraction of the vaginal swabs?
That's correct.
And what is the second item?
The partial YSTR DNA profile previously detected from the non-sperm fraction of the cervical swabs.
And the third item?
The major contributor YSTR DNA profile previously detected from the swab from the right forearm.
The fourth item?
The partial YSTR DNA profile previously detected from the swab from the left forearm.
And the next item?
The major contributor Y profile detected from the swab from the left wrist.
And the next item?
The partial YSTR DNA profile previously detected from the swab from the left ankle.
And the next item?
The YSTR DNA profile previously detected from the swab from the right ankle.
And the next item?
The partial Y profile detected from the swab from the right wrist.
And the next item?
The major contributor Y profile previously detected from the swab from the left neck.
Next item?
The Y profile previously detected from the swab from the left posterior neck.
And the next item?
The partial Y profile previously detected from the swab from the right arm.
Next item?
The partial YSTR DNA profile previously detected from the swab from the left arm.
And the next item?
The major contributor Y profile previously detected from the swab from the mons pubis.
And the next item?
The partial Y profile previously detected from the swab from the left palm.
The next item?
The Y profile previously detected from the swab from the chest.
The next item?
The major contributor Y profile detected from the washing of the right hand fingernail clippings.
Next item?
That would be the cable.
That is the total of the areas on Nicole's body where Mr. Burch's profile is consistent with the Y profile you've located.
Unless I missed a line, that's correct.
And the item after that, you were about to indicate also that Mr. Burch's profile, or the Y profile that you developed from Mr. Burch's sample, is also consistent with the partial YSTR DNA profile previously detected from the swabbing of one section of cable. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And again, the cable was the item that you were shown previously in the exhibits, the black plastic coated cord.
That's correct.
And his YSTR profile was also consistent with that previously detected on the sock where you located the autosomal profile,
That's correct.
and also consistent with a swabbing from a YSTR profile you developed from the other sock. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And finally, his YSTR DNA profile was consistent with a YSTR DNA profile you previously detected from the exterior sleeves and shoulder areas of Nicole's shirt.
That's correct.
With respect to all of those YSTR DNA profiles with which Mr. Burch's profile is consistent, was Douglas Dietrich excluded as a contributor to all of those YSTR profiles?
He would have been excluded as the possible source of anything I had designated Y profile 1. That's correct. Some of these were mixture profiles. I can't recall if he was excluded from every single one or not.
Thank you.
I'd like to go back to publishing the exhibit that was up there
previously to talk about the statistical conclusion?
Go ahead. Again, this is Exhibit 110.
Page 4 is the first place that you indicate a statistical conclusion, is that correct?
That's correct.
With respect to the YSTR profile that you developed from Mr. Burch. You indicated the same statistical conclusion for the non-sperm fractions of the vaginal and cervical swabs, as well as the left ankle, right wrist, left posterior neck, left arm, left palm, and chest. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what is the statistical conclusion with respect to those items?
So when I searched these evidentiary Y profiles in this database, it searched against 5,259 profiles in the database. And these evidentiary profiles were found to occur 0 times. So there were no other profiles in that database that we searched that matched these evidentiary profiles. We apply what we call a 95% confidence interval onto that finding, or to give a more conservative estimate on how common these Y profiles might be in the general population. Applying that confidence interval, these evidentiary Y profiles are not expected to occur more frequently than 1 in every 1,757 individuals in the U.S. population.
So even though you searched a database that had 5,259 profiles in it, and this profile does not occur at all, the statistical conclusion is still that 1 in every 1,700 individuals would be included as a possible contributor.
It could be, that's correct. These numbers are highly dependent on how many profiles are in the database.
But again, these are very conservative numbers in that you are attempting to not overstate how accurate they are. Is that fair?
That's correct, yes.
And that's why the 95% confidence interval is applied?
That's correct.
So again, in fact, with respect to all of those items that we just listed, there isn't another profile in the database currently, or at least at the time that you ran that statistical conclusion, that matched the YSTR profile that you found.
That's correct, yes, for those items.
And then on the top of page 5, there's a different statistical conclusion with respect to the swabs from the left wrist, left neck, mons pubis, as well as the washing of the right hand fingernail clippings, the swabbings of the socks, and the swabbing of the exterior sleeves and shoulder areas of the shirt. Is that correct?
That's correct. These are all major contributor Y profiles. So in all of these particular profiles, they're all mixture profiles. However, I was able to determine the major portion, so the portion from the male individual who contributed the most male DNA to that sample. So in these, or in this paragraph, this statistic is the same statistic as the one we just spoke about. The major Y profile was searched against 5,259 profiles and found to occur 0 times, with the statistic of 1 in every 1,757.
So this notion again of a mixture is kind of akin to the answer when I asked you about Doug being excluded from all of the Y source profiles. There were occasions where you found a mixture of YSTR DNA, is that correct?
That's correct. So there would be multiple male individuals in those samples.
And you were able to determine a major source contributor. What is the difference between a major source and a minor source contributor?
So a major contributor would be the contribution of DNA from the male individual who contributed the most DNA to that mixture. So simply it's the Y profile from that person who contributed the most male DNA. The minor would have contributed a lesser amount of DNA, and it's typical that we can't make any comparisons to that minor component in these Y mixtures.
Is it typical when you see a mixture of Y DNA profiles that are you sometimes able to develop specifics as to 2 different Y profiles in that mixture?
Could you repeat that?
Would it be typical for you to be able to actually see not just a major source and a minor source that isn't comparable, but actually be able to give some conclusion as to the minor source, or is that unusual?
That's fairly unusual.
And that's because in the first place, the YSTR is based on you're doing a YSTR based on the fact that you have a substantial amount of female DNA, is that right? Relative to male DNA?
Not all the time, but that's the time that it's often used, that's correct.
And in these instances, that was the primary reason why you were using Y profiles, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Because Nicole's DNA, or the female DNA, it essentially permeated and was showing up much stronger than the male DNA.
Yes, there is far more female DNA in most of these samples than any trace amount of male DNA, that's correct.
So in these situations here where you had the YSTR DNA profile and you're able to determine a major source, how much DNA are we talking about when you see a minor source?
Less than the major source.
Okay. So it's not any more specific. Is this a very small amount of DNA? Is it a...
Yes, it would be a small amount, generally.
The statistical conclusion listed in the next paragraph, so the second paragraph down on page 5, is the conclusion with respect to the swabbing of cable. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what is that statistical conclusion?
So this partial Y profile that I had detected from the swabbing of the cable was searched against 6,542 profiles in the database, and that partial profile was found to occur 77 times. So applying that confidence interval, this partial YSTR DNA profile is not expected to occur more frequently than approximately 1 in every 70 individuals in the U.S. population.
And so again, the reason why the statistical conclusion with respect to that profile is less than the others is because you have what?
There are just fewer genetic markers that I was able to detect, so we're searching, there's more profiles in the database that would have that portion of the profile that I detected.
But again, that profile is consistent with all of the other Y profile 1 profiles that you developed.
Well, the genetic markers that I detected from this swabbing from the cable all are consistent with the Y profile 1 genetic markers, that's correct.
So for example, if you had 10 genetic markers that you could view on a particular profile, you would have a better statistical conclusion than if you could only see 5 genetic markers, correct?
It's possible, that's correct. But these numbers are also highly dependent on how many profiles that it can be searched against, which can change the statistic.
And then with respect, the next paragraph, with respect to the swab from the right forearm, there's a different statistical conclusion for that?
That's correct.
And that was found to occur 12 times in the database of 6,542 profiles?
That's correct.
And that resulted in 1 in every 338 individuals potentially having that particular profile.
That's correct.
And then finally, on the last paragraph of page 5, the swab from the left forearm was searched against a database including 5,259 profiles and found to occur 18 times, meaning that it was 1 in 198 individuals may have that profile.
That's correct.
And again, those are all conservative statistical conclusions, is that correct?
Yes, these are all estimates.
Mr. Scott, I'm going to mark one more exhibit for you here. I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 111. Can you identify that document?
Yes, this is a report that I authored, or a copy of a report that I authored, dated February 14th, 2018.
And what items are addressed in that particular report?
We have item CA, which is a tissue, item CB, which was a cutout of like a carpet square that was cut out, item CC, which was another tissue, item CD, which were swabs reportedly from the carpet, and item CE, which is a swab reportedly from a shower floor ledge.
And what was your purpose in analyzing those particular items?
I was asked to see if there was blood on any of those items, and if there was blood, to determine a profile, or to attempt to produce a profile.
With respect to the carpet item taken from the Dietrich residence, did you observe any blood on that item?
I performed the chemical tests for the possible presence of blood, and all those tests were negative. So I concluded that blood is not detected on the carpet.
And with respect to the swab taken from the shower in the master bedroom of the Dietrich residence, did you perform a test to indicate whether or not there was blood present in that item?
That's correct, and that test was also negative.
And then with respect to the tissues, did you locate blood on that particular item?
Yes, blood was identified on both those tissues.
And did you do any follow-up testing with respect to the blood located on those tissues?
Yes, I performed DNA analysis on the staining on those tissues, and I detected the same female profile, the same autosomal female profile.
So the same profile was present on each of the tissues?
That's correct.
Did you compare those to the known samples that you had in this case?
Yes, I did.
And were all of the known samples in this case excluded as possible contributors to the blood on that tissue?
That's correct.
Including Nicole Vanderheiden and Douglas Dietrich?
Yes, Nicole and Doug were both excluded as the possible source. The profiles did not match theirs.
Your Honor, I would move for admission of that exhibit as well.
Subject to cross, any objection to 112?
No, thank you.
112 is received.
Mr. Scott, with respect to the YSTR conclusions indicated on the September 12, 2016 report, I'd like to ask you to head back to that just briefly. On page 3 of that report, the first two items that are listed where Mr. Burch's profile is consistent are a non-sperm fraction of the vaginal swab and a non-sperm fraction of cervical swabs. Can you describe the difference between a non-sperm fraction and a sperm fraction of swabs?
Yes. So if I analyze an item of evidence that may have semen or sperm cells on that item, I might perform a differential DNA extraction. This differential extraction separates the sample into two parts. First, I would add some chemicals to the sample in order to release any DNA that might be present in any cells other than sperm cells. So any skin cells, blood cells, cells from any vaginal material would be released in this non-sperm fraction. I would then take off that, or separate the non-sperm fraction from any cells that are left over, which would hopefully include any possible sperm cells. And then I would attempt to release any DNA that's remaining from the sperm cells and anything that's left over in the sperm fraction. So I performed that differential extraction on the vaginal swabs and the cervical swabs. And in both of the non-sperm fractions, I detected this Y profile 1.
I'm drawing your attention to the, I'll go back again to the July 19th, 2016 report, which is the first report that you generated here. You were able to make YSTR conclusions with respect to sperm fractions on the vaginal swabs. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you developed a major source contributor to the sperm fraction of the vaginal swabs. Is that right?
That's correct. I detected a mixture profile from at least 2 male individuals from the sperm fraction of the vaginal swabs. One of those 2 contributors contributed more DNA, and I was able to determine a major Y contributor.
And were you able to determine any consistencies with respect to that major contributor?
Yes, this major contributor matched the Y profile that I detected from Douglas and Dylan. Remember, people who share a parent-child or a father-son relationship will share the same Y profile. So this major contributor Y profile matched the Y profile that I detected from both Doug and Dylan.
From what?
From both Douglas Dietrich and Dylan.
Now, the fact that there is a mixture of at least 2 males detected from the sperm fraction of vaginal swabs, does that mean that there's actual sperm contributed by 2 different males?
Not necessarily. If there is sperm, or if there is sperm cells in a sample, you would hope that all of the DNA from that sperm cells would be in the sperm fraction. However, there can be carryover or transfer from possible non-sperm cells to the sperm fraction as well.
Again, the major source was consistent with the Y profile of Douglas Dietrich and Dylan Dietrich, is that correct?
That's correct.
In terms of there being a sperm component, were you able to make any conclusions with respect to this particular sperm fraction in terms of the amount that was present or seen, amount of DNA?
There was very little male DNA present in the sperm fraction. So if this DNA came from sperm cells, then there would be a very, very low number of sperm cells.
Are you able to draw any conclusions from the fact that there was such a small amount of male DNA on those particular cells?
What kind of conclusion?
Potentially as to the age of the sperm?
Typically, when we work cases that involve a kit being taken from a female individual, the longer or the further after the assault occurred that kit is taken, the less sperm that we would see. So if individual waits a day or 2 after the assault, there would be less sperm than if the kit was taken, or generally less sperm than if the kit was taken at the time of the assault. I would assume that the sperm cells are like draining or degrading away as time goes on. So if we see a very low amount of sperm cells like this, it's possible that the event that deposited the sperm cells might have been a few days prior to when the kit was collected. But that's just a guess.
And you use the term assault. Sperm doesn't always have to be deposited
No,
its ultimate assault, correct?
That's
but you
correct.
see these typically in what's called a SANE kit or a sexual assault nurse examiner kit.
That's correct, yes.
That's typically where you're examining sperm and non-sperm fraction.
Most often correct.
Thank you. No further questions at this time.
Counsel, where are we at this point? Are we going to try to conclude cross-examination at this time?
May we approach?
Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've agreed that it shouldn't be too much longer. We're going to try to finish up today. Logically, it'd make more sense. Mr. Scott won't have to travel back here on Monday. So if you could just continue to be patient. Attorney Schuckert needs a minute. I'm going to make a quick call, so if everyone just wants to remain here, if you want to stand up and stretch, that'd be fine, and we'll be back on the record in about 2 minutes. Have to do that. All right, Attorney Schuckert, are you ready for your cross-examination?
Yes, thank you.
All right, go right ahead.
Mr. Scott, in terms of touch DNA, can you just give us a very brief rundown again of what exactly that is?
Yeah, so touch DNA would be when an object is handled, any DNA that might be left behind on that object, supposedly by skin cells.
So if you touch something for a longer period of time or more often, is that more likely to leave DNA?
Generally, yeah.
What are some reasons why DNA would not be left if you touch something?
If the duration of the contact is very short, you might not leave enough DNA to be detected. That individual just simply might not shed enough DNA for us to be able to detect. Otherwise, if somebody was wearing gloves or something like that, you generally wouldn't detect touch DNA from them.
When somebody swabs an item for DNA, is it possible that that swab would miss DNA on the item?
I suppose when we swab an item, it's probably not very likely that we're going to swab up every single cell that's on the item. So it's possible that there could be some DNA left behind that wasn't swabbed up.
Can you explain what secondary touch DNA is?
Yeah, so when we talk about touch DNA, generally there's the touch DNA can be through primary or secondary transfer. So a primary transfer of DNA would be if I directly handle an object, I would I might transfer my DNA directly to that object. So that would be primary DNA transfer. Secondary DNA transfer would be a transfer of DNA through an intermediary object. So if I touch an object, I set it down and somebody else then handles that object, it's possible that my DNA could be transferred to them through the intermediary object. So that would be secondary transfer.
So it's possible for DNA to end up on an object even if that person didn't themselves touch it?
It is possible, yes.
Specifically talking about item N in your reports, how is YSTR DNA, what is the measure of unit for that, or unit of measure?
The unit of measure?
Yeah.
When we quantitate it, we measure it in nanograms per microliter.
And what's the lowest level cutoff where you'd be willing to say that that matches an individual or a YSTR chromosome? Is it Y chromosome or YSTR profile?
A YSTR profile. So when we have a DNA sample and we quantitate it and we determine how much total human DNA and how much male DNA is in that sample, we have a Y or a cutoff that we might generally use. So if a sample has a higher amount of male DNA that's above that cutoff, we would expect to obtain a usable Y profile from that object. However, if there's less male DNA on that sample that's below the cutoff, there's a better chance that we won't get a usable profile, so we generally won't even try to obtain a Y profile.
Do you know what the male quantity nanograms per microliter was on item N?
It was it was roughly 0.002 nanograms per microliter.
Was that in just one of the sections? Were the other 2.001?
Yes, out of the 6 swabbings, the one swabbing, the N3 swabbing that I took on for YSTR analysis had the most DNA. That one was the 0.002. The other swabbings had a lesser amount of DNA.
And item N, what is that? That's the cable we were talking about, right?
Yeah, yes, item N was one section of the cable. That's correct.
How small is 0.001 nanograms per microliter?
I mean, it's hard to...
Is it less than the head of a pin?
So this, the concentration is simply how much DNA is present in a sample. It doesn't really have any association with size.
Okay. Would you consider that a low amount for the male quantity?
It's generally a low amount. The 0.002 is right at our cutoff. So if there was less male DNA in that sample, there's a lesser chance of the Y testing working out.
And the 0.001, would that be below that cutoff then?
Yes, it is. However, I should clarify that it's not impossible to get usable results from samples below the cutoff. That cutoff is simply a tool that we use to try and determine which samples might be best to perform the YSTR testing on.
One more thing about DNA. Can DNA actually tell you when something was touched or when it was worn?
No, it can. As far as the analysis that we perform, we cannot determine how long DNA was on that object prior to our testing.
So for example, item AL is the Fitbit. You can't tell when the DNA was in contact with that Fitbit device or give us a time period for that, correct?
No, that's correct.
In terms of item J1, I believe that was shoes collected, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And there was an inconclusive result for blood?
That's correct.
So that means that that item could have had blood on it?
It's possible that swabbing that I took, there could have been a small amount of blood on there. However, when I took it on for DNA, I did not detect that amount of DNA was below our cutoff for further testing.
So you couldn't tell whose blood that was?
If it was blood, there was not enough DNA present to test.
And I believe that's item, the left Air Jordan shoe?
Item J1, correct. Yes, the left shoe.
Do you know, was that Douglas Dietrich's shoe?
I believe that was a shoe taken from his garage, if I remember correctly, or from his residence.
Now I want you to focus on item S that's labeled as paper towel. Do you remember how the lab, when you open that item or that evidence kit, were there many paper towels in there?
I don't recall offhand. I could check my notes real quick if you wanted me to.
Sure.
I have just one paper towel. It was like a brown, like paper towel.
So you were only sent, or at least you only tested that one brown paper towel, correct?
That's correct.
Did you ever test any DNA swabs listed as B1 to B9?
No, I did not. I believe those were additional swabs taken from the car that were not.
I believe the door handles on the Buick Rendezvous.
I don't know exactly where they're taken from, but the only sample taken from that car that I tested was the B15 swabbing of the blood.
Item BG, that is, I believe, a bra. Can you tell me what the YSTR findings were on that? Actually, I can just read it to you. So, a major contributor determined at 11 genetic markers. The YSTR DNA profile is consistent with both Douglas Dietrich and Dylan Vanderheiden. Is that correct?
Yep, that sounds like a conclusion that I would have made. I don't believe I have that report in front of me, though.
It would be your August 23rd report, and I just read specifically BG6 on page 4 of 7.
I don't believe we entered that one.
Again, for the record, this is exhibit what? All right, this is 112.
Can you tell us what exhibit 112 is?
112 is a report that I generated, dated August 23rd, 2016.
And does that accurately reflect your report from that day?
Yes, it does.
Judge, I would move to admit that exhibit.
Subject to redirect, any objection? 12 is received.
Can you tell us on item BG where Doug Dietrich and Dylan Dietrich's YSTR profiles were found?
Yes, I took several swabbings from item BG, which was a bra. One of the swabbings was a swabbing of the interior edges of the cup, which was designated BG1. I developed a mixture profile, or a YSTR DNA mixture profile, and I was able to determine a major contributor that was consistent with the profile from both Douglas Dietrich and Dylan Vanderheiden and Dylan.
And is that also on the clasp?
Yes, the swabbing of the clasp area, BG6, also a mixture, a YSTR DNA mixture of 2 male individuals with a major contributor that was consistent with both Douglas Dietrich and Dylan.
Now, YSTR DNA, that could be either Doug or Dylan, correct?
That's correct. Doug and Dylan both share the same YSTR profile, so it's impossible to differentiate the two just looking at the Y profile.
So hypothetically, because I know you might not know this, if Dylan was an infant and Nicole was breastfeeding, that could be an explanation of that DNA being there, correct?
If Dylan's DNA got on the bra, that's correct, yeah.
So now on that report on BI, that's item BI, that's Nikki's tank top. Was there blood results for Nikki's tank top?
Yes, I performed a presumptive test for the possible presence of blood on staining on that tank top, and that was a positive test.
And then in terms of why STR testing, were Dietrich and Dillon major contributors?
So I took several swabbings from that tank top as well. And I performed YSTR, or Y analysis on those swabbings. One of the swabbings, the swabbing of the exterior front of the tank top, BI1, I developed a mixture of DNA from at least 4 male individuals with a major contributor that was consistent with both Douglas Dietrich and Dillon.
Thank you. And then going back to your first report on July 19th, I want you to focus on item H1.
Okay.
And that is the left-hand fingernail clippings recovered from Nicole Vanderheiden, correct?
That's correct.
And there was a presumptive test for blood on that item as well, too, correct?
That's correct. Those fingernail clippings was a presumptive positive for the possible presence of blood.
And that's coming from her left fingernails, right?
That's correct. Yeah, these are clippings that were clipped off and given to me in an envelope.
And there was blood detected?
The possible presence of blood, that's correct.
And then can you tell us about the YSTR profile on that item?
Yeah, so when I received these fingernail clippings, I took a washing of some of the clippings. So I essentially put the clippings into some liquid and agitated it, trying to get any DNA or any skin cells or any cells actually that are on the clippings into the liquid. Then performed my DNA analysis on that liquid, which is the washing of the fingernail clippings. I analyzed the clippings for both autosomal and YSTR analysis, and then the YSTR analysis, I developed a mixture of DNA from at least 2 male individuals, with a major contributor that was consistent with the Y profile from both Douglas and Dillon.
And then one last item, if you could look at AH2, that's defined as what?
AH2 was a pair of underwear.
And those were Nicole's underwear, correct?
Yes.
And there was blood present in those underwear?
Yes, I performed the presumptive test for the possible presence of blood, but there was a large amount of reddish-brown staining on the underwear.
You said there was a large amount of that
Yes.
staining? And then in terms of the YSTR contributor, the major YSTR contributor was from both Douglas and or Dillon Vanderheiden, correct? Well, Douglas Dietrich and Dillon Vanderheiden.
Yes, I took several swabbings of the underwear as well. One of these swabbings, are you referring to H2A? And oh, both of them, yes. Yes, so I took a swabbing of the interior and the exterior waistbands of the underwear, so two separate swabbings. And there was male DNA present in both those swabbings, so I performed the YSTR analysis. I was able to determine mixtures of DNA from at least 4 male individuals on both of those swabbings, with major contributors in both that are both consistent with the YSTR profile from both Douglas and Dillon.
I just need one more moment, Judge.
Sure. Whatever you need.
I have nothing further, Judge. Thank you.
Any redirect, Attorney Lassay?
Just briefly,
Go ahead.
you were questioned about item H1, which was the left-hand fingernail clippings. With respect to item H2, which is the right-hand fingernail clippings, did you also detect the presence of blood in those fingernail clippings?
Yes, I detected the possible presence of blood on those fingernail clippings.
And in the right-hand fingernail clippings, you were able to develop a Y DNA profile that was located there as well?
Yes, similar to the left-hand clippings, the right-hand clippings, I took a washing of those as well. And there was some male DNA present, so I performed the YSTR DNA analysis on those clippings. I detected a mixture of DNA from at least 3 male individuals from the washing of the right-hand clippings, and with a major contributor that was consistent with the Y profile 1. So Douglas, Gregory, Dylan, Tyler, and Brian were all excluded as possible contributors to that major contributor profile.
So with respect to fingernail clipping H2, that profile was consistent with that of George Burch.
That's correct.
On several of the clothing items, it looks like you noted multiple male contributors or potential male contributors on the clothing items. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is that common that on clothing items you often see multiple different contributors to DNA sources?
Yeah, it's definitely common to see multiple contributors.
What are some of the reasons why it's common to see multiple contributors on clothing?
I would only be guessing.
You talked about transfer DNA before. If clothing from different people is washed or stored together, is that one way that DNA could potentially transfer?
That's certainly one possibility. That's correct.
Talk briefly about the shoes that you collected. You were specifically asked about J1, which is one of the Jordan shoes collected from Mr. Dietrich's residence. And again, on those shoes you tested, on J1 in particular, you tested several different swabbings to determine a presumptive positive for blood. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And how many swabbings total from J1?
If I remember correctly, I believe it was like 5 or 6 areas that I tested for the possible presence of blood.
And all of them were negative except one, which was you determined to be inconclusive.
That's correct.
And I believe you testified earlier that that did not indicate in the same way that you would expect a positive to indicate. Is that right?
That's correct. Typically, if blood is present, we would get a quick color change to bright pink. This particular test was a slow, weak color change, not consistent with what I would normally see for blood. So, however, since it still changed to pink, I reported it as inconclusive.
And then you did follow-up testing by swabbing the area to determine if DNA was present in that area.
Yes, that's correct.
And you noted that there was not sufficient DNA to conduct any testing.
Correct.
And again, I believe on direct you indicated that if you had actually had observable amount of blood, it would be typical that you would find sufficient DNA for testing.
That's correct.
You were also asked about the quantification or quantity of DNA available for testing, particularly on the item that you indicated was the cable. On the cable, you noted several different low levels of male DNA, and the highest was the 0.002 nanograms per milliliter. Is that correct?
Yeah, nanograms per microliter, correct.
Microliter, I apologize, yes. So obviously, with everything related to DNA, we are talking about very small items, which is why when you're asked about, a pinhead or the size, you're kind of laugh, because this nanograms per microliter is a very, very small amount, correct?
Yes, yeah, pretty much.
Does the quantity of DNA available, does that mean that if there's only 0.002 nanograms as opposed to 0.5 nanograms, that the sample is actually less accurate?
Oh, no, certainly not. So typically, the more DNA that's present in a sample, that just would lead to a more complete profile. So if I had, say, half a nanogram, 0.5 nanograms of male DNA, I would expect to obtain a full, complete profile. If I'm down near the cutoff, like we were for the wire, I would expect to possibly not get a full profile. However, the profile that I did detect is accurate.
So again, those thresholds are not because you're concerned about the accuracy of the results, it's just about whether or not you think you'll be able to develop a profile given such small amount of DNA.
That's correct.
No further questions.
Recross.
Yes, quickly, Judge. I just want to clarify, I know we've talked about this a couple times, the blood results on J1, which are their shoes, I know that it was a slow color change, but that still could be blood, right? And it still could be human blood.
There is that possibility. That's correct. It could be a very small amount of blood.
Does the low quantity of DNA on an item mean the potential of transfer or secondary DNA is more likely or was more likely?
I wouldn't say that it's necessarily more likely. I would typically expect a primary transfer, so direct contact to transfer more DNA to an object than through secondary transfer. However, the amount of DNA that is transferred through primary contact would be almost impossible to predict. Sometimes you might handle an object and not transfer enough DNA to detect. Sometimes you can handle an object and transfer more than enough DNA to detect. So just because a small amount of DNA is on an object, that doesn't necessarily indicate primary or secondary transfer.
Thank you. When you received the tank top and the underwear, did those items appear to have recently been washed?
No, there was a large amount of staining on those items.
Thank you. No further questions.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Scott, thank you very much. You may be a step down. You're excused and have a good trip back.
Thank you.
For the record, anything else from the state today, Attorney Wilson?
Not today.
All right. Or anything from the defense before we break, Attorney Schuckert?
No, thank you, Judge.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we ended up putting in a pretty full day. Again, don't talk to anyone about this case. Don't read any information, articles, watch anything about this case over the weekend. Have a good weekend, a safe weekend, and we'll see you back here at 8:30 on Monday. Thank you very much.
All rise.